Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lawson Brigham from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I also am what they call me as a fellow at the Coast Guard Academy's fledgling Arctic Center for Arctic Study and Policy, trying to gear up a center of excellence at the Coast Guard Academy. We have an excellent panel today to talk about what we in PAIM and the Arctic Council call now marine operations and shipping. Arctic shipping for many people is a lot of different things, but for 99% of the people I deal with is trans-Arctic shipping when it's all destinational. So even the terminology, and I'll just say as an introduction that the word transit in the maritime world is from port to Milwaukee to Sturgeon Bay or wherever, Miami to New York. The proper terms are trans-Arctic voyage. It's a hard one. But the word transit, when you look at numbers of the Northern Sea Route, there's a lot of misinformation, even published in The Economist and others, that revolve around this word transit. So even terminology of this topic, complex topic of Arctic marine transport, what does it all mean? And we have Captain Ed Page with us from the Marine Exchange of Alaska, the visionary of this marine exchange and surveillance and monitoring system, prevention system, right? Sure. And Drew Pearce is well known in Alaska as a long-term legislator and lawyer in Alaska, and she's going to report on one of the studies of the Arctic Circle's working group, I think, on marine transport. And Captain Hawkins heads a division, directorate at Coast Guard headquarters that deals with design of ships and standardization, but he also goes to IMO and is going to say a few words about the Polar Code. And Professor Vladimir Pavlenko, you've seen this afternoon, and is well known in the community. It's nice to have you here to talk about the Northern Sea Route a little bit, and not least of which is Molly McCannon, one of the country's leading experts on observing systems and the director of the Alaska Ocean Observing System. So I think we'll start first with Ed. And we have a couple, some of the speakers have just a couple slides, and I'm supposed to keep everybody on time. So Ed?
You got my timer on.
Yeah.
I'm with the Marine Exchange of Alaska, which is a nonprofit maritime organization in Juneau, Alaska, and I got two of my board members here, so I have to behave myself, both my board. But I've been involved in marine safety operations for about 45 years, between my Coast Guard experience 30 years, and out in the private industry for 15 years. There have been a couple of wake-up calls. I know there's concern about potential for accidents in the Arctic, and it's a very fragile environment. May I have the next slide, please? And I've been involved in several cases over the years, and most significantly, most impactfully for me anyway, and many others, was Exxon Valdez oil spill. And so I've become an evangelist for prevention. Spent 3 years working that oil spill, and then I've subsequently been involved in events like the Celadang U, what have you. And I became a believer that the challenge is we don't have maritime domain awareness. You can't fix or address problems you don't know they're out there. If the fire department doesn't get the alarm, they're never going to be very effective. And so you really need maritime domain awareness. And then from there, you need to do something with that information. You need to do maritime domain management. Next slide, please. So Celadang U, that picture just up beforehand, which I should have forwarded on, is an example where we didn't know the vessel's in trouble until too late. You can back up one. If you can even go backwards, that's great. That we didn't know it was in trouble, didn't know it was breaking down, didn't have any risk mitigating measures, stay offshore, what have you, notify anybody when you're in trouble. None of that happened, and therefore, that's one vessel split in two. 6 people died. The Coast Guard tried to rescue the crew, and of course, they're doing so, their helicopter crashed, and the people they rescued perished. Major oil spill, loss of cargo, major impacts. So mainly because we didn't know what was going on at the time. Next slide. So fortunately, a lot of people in this room and people we've talked about several days are working this issue. And there's a shared interest and commitment in maritime domain awareness. You've heard some of those presentations. Right there is some of the folks that we deal with. Clearly the Coast Guard and the state of Alaska, but also the Arctic Research Council, the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, Alaska Ocean Observing System, and we work very closely with the Alaska Maritime Prevention Response Network, an organization that stood up a couple of years ago to address the risk of vessels and casualties. Next slide, please. So what we've done, together with those group and contribution of the whole Coast Guard, state, and the maritime industry, is built one of the largest, in fact, the largest vessel compliance monitoring system in the world, And we're using satellite AIS and 130 AIS terrestrial stations, and we're also transmitting stations and weather stations throughout Alaska. The red dots represent the automatic identification system terrestrial sites and also some of the transmission sites. Next slide, please. And this is today. I just took a screenshot this morning of what we're looking at this morning of traffic in Alaska. Next slide. Here's the traffic the last 10 days in the Arctic, and the Bering Strait in particular. Next slide. There's traffic last year. So this maritime domain awareness has given us information, which we've heard some of our senators talk about, the importance of information to make good decisions. We're giving information, we can identify the risks. Next slide. And then this information is being managed. That's the key thing, is managing this data and doing something with it. And we're managing in Juneau, in our operations center, 1.5 million square miles. Next largest system of that nature is Australia for the Great Barrier Reef, 100,000 square miles. So this is substantially larger. Next slide. And then what are we monitoring? We're monitoring those vessels and ensuring vessels are complying with the risk mitigating measures that have been established for Aleutian Islands and the Arctic. Next slide. That's distances offshore, that's authorized passes, when a vessel breaks down, I got the timer on, that we actually know about it early on. Next slide. Here's a change. Before, vessel with serpentine, the top left, serpentine, Aleutian Islands, high risk. Same exact vessel, after we implement the risk mitigating measures, is doing the standard of care, Great Circle route, distance offshore. Next slide. And if they go the wrong place, we call them, they turn around, go the right way. Next slide. Polar Code talks about priority in monitoring tracking ships and also the Arctic people. Next slide. We pay attention, we read that stuff, we work with the Coast Guard, the Next Generation Navigational Safety Information System. We're working them as virtual aids in navigation. We're actually putting buoys in ice virtually, because you can't put them physically in there, like in Cook Inlet. We're doing that and testing that. We can disseminate dynamic marine protected areas and ATBAs with AIS. We can notify vessels of whales. We can monitor compliance automatically and set up alarms. Next slide. And we're also tracking the local natives, so we know where they are and where the big ships are to minimize conflict. Next slide. And giving the communities access to this information so they know the vessels in their backyard. Just get on their iPhone, they got the information. Free. Next slide. So how's this applied? A couple days ago, you might have heard the comment, the comment mentioned this the other day about the Maersk vessel that broke down. Next slide. That's a 900-foot container ship, 20 miles containers, on instant passage going to Alaska. Our watch watched it, sent this graphic to the Coast Guard, said this vessel's not under command, and it's going 0.4 knots. It's like watching a car on a highway going 5 miles an hour. Something's wrong. Yeah, it's broken down. They contact the vessel, say, we're okay. Next slide. But we said, well, it's drifting from 13 miles to 5 miles offshore. Doesn't look like it's okay. Coast Guard engaged some tugs. It was towed in Dutch Harbor. 3 days later, they made repairs. That could have been a Celadang U had that not been intervened, detected, monitored. By monitoring, just like the police on the highway with the radar guns, influences behavior. Monitoring vessels influences behavior and detects incidents before they are major incidents. Next slide. Joint interest in this. I mean, we're collaborating with our Russian colleagues. The Coast Guard's working on access routes, so we're not completely there, but we've implemented a lot of things over the last 5 years to manage risk and identify problems early on. So it's still work to be done, but we made a lot of progress, so it's not like the Wild West, which it was a couple of years ago. Now it's no longer time's up. Done.
Great. Thank you.
How's that?
Good grief.
Go ahead, Drew. We'll call up your slides. Thank you, Ray.
Great. So I'm here today to talk about the Arctic Circle report on shipping and ports. Those of you who aren't familiar with the Arctic Circle, it was founded by President Grimson of Iceland. Go ahead to the next one, please. And the chair of the Arctic Circle board is Alice Rogoff. Next slide. Authors of the Arctic Circle report include Meade Treadwell, who would have given this presentation today, except he climbed on a plane headed to Japan last night. Myself and Paul Foos, chair of the Alaska Marine Exchange, and I sit on the board. We all got involved in marine safety after the Exxon Valdez, just as did Captain Page and many others in Alaska. In fact, most of us just have changed hats a lot of times, but have stayed involved. Next slide. The Arctic is central to global transportation and aviation today, shipping and surface modes tomorrow. Go ahead. And then to the next one. We already have 10,000 people a day and numerous flights, lots of cargo that is transiting the Arctic in the air. Next, there are at least 3 Arctic rail links that are in some sort of a planning stage. The Russians coming out of Archangel. The Finns are building rail to connect to the coast of the Arctic in Norway. And there are 2 separate projects that I'm familiar with that are looking at trying to connect the Alaska Railroad to the lower 48 through Canada via rail, coming down to connect in probably Alberta. So what's left? We have opening seaways. Next slide. And that's what we want to talk about today. Next. Working with Dr. Brigham, the Arctic Council Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment in 2009 looked at what the safety agenda should be, and that was updated in 2013. Next. The 3 basic questions that Meade, Paul, and I have been asking is, can nations work together to establish safe, secure, and reliable seaways in the North? Can a League of Arctic Ports help global shippers benefit from new and shorter shipping routes? And how do we pay for sustainable Arctic shipping infrastructure? We recognize that Russia certainly has the Northern Sea Route structure and that the Canadians have the Northwest Passage, but we're looking at a polar transit and how to set up an actual seaway that is a polar transit that would be an international effort. Next. The International Seaway, we believe, could cooperate across administrations and support trans-Arctic shipping with an international fleet of breaker escorts. Next. Our approach is to draft legislation. No, next to the our approach. No. There. Next is to draft legislation to study, do a study plan for sea ice conditions and icebreaker assistance and what's going to be needed, and when, obviously, it's going to be needed, to estimate the costs for basic seaway services, figure out what sort of number of transits you would need to cover those costs, figure out what your tariff rates might look like, and whether or not you could have a competitive position doing some sort of an international cooperative effort. Next. Paul Foos has been working on putting together a League of Arctic Ports. He, by the way, was the mayor in Dutch Harbor when the Exxon Valdez happened, and the mayors who weren't part of the oiled mayors group all wanted the same sort of basic protections in their seaways, particularly Dutch Harbor, as the Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet got after the Exxon Valdez because of OPA-90 and our state legislation. So our approach in this case is to invite Arctic ports around all 8 nations to convene, to create a constituency for a seaway, to have coordinated infrastructure planning with all of them, and also to have a unified voice to work with the financing community. Next slide. Looking at how you might finance this sort of infrastructure, going to the development banks, and actually that's one of the tasks that Meade has on his plate in Japan, even as we speak. Looking at infrastructure investment banks, intergovernmental initiatives, anchor projects that could facilitate Arctic shipping, and global maritime insurance, because we're seeing the insurance industry drive some of the requisites in the Polar Code and others of our laws and regulations. If the insurance companies won't insure your cargo, you are not going to be using any route through the Arctic. So we're looking, next slide, at the St. Lawrence Seaway as a model. It's a great international model. It took legislation from both the United States, also from the Canadians, to set up an international entity. And you have basically one-stop shopping as you approach the St. Lawrence Seaway, and you go through, regardless of which side of the border you're on, which ports you're going to, you go through using the seaway. So we'd like to apply that model as much as we can to the Arctic. We have been looking at parallel legislation or an international agreement where we could make that happen so we could offer the service. We've been looking at revenue and regulatory models that could support icebreakers along with navigational aids and also safety aids. We are looking for support from insurers and salvers, and frankly, that's where we've gotten the most support so far. We also are looking at the legal differences, and we have to respect those, of course, because the differences in water status, depending upon where you are. And we're looking at perhaps invoking UNCLOS Article 234. Next. Next, please. The Russians, of course, are very interested in increasing the viability and the use of the Northern Sea Route. They've undertaken, as we all know, a huge infrastructure build-out, which is important to making that a viable option on a long-term basis. At the Arctic Economic Council meeting in February of this year, they made a presentation talking about their view of the Northern Sea Route economics. Next. They looked at world seaborne trade and the Northern Sea Route and where they thought they could take actual cargo business away from other transit routes. Next. Looking at projects and how they could leverage the advantage of the shorter distance of the Northern Sea Route and the quicker time between hubs. Last slide. So you can sign up. I hope it's better shown back there. You can sign up to read the working papers and also to comment, which we'd very much like, at Arctic Circle Seaways Report.wordpress.com.
Thank you, Drew. Excellent. Great. Different models, different views, different kind of themes of how to approach this marine transport systematic look. I think the League of Ports is kind of an intriguing and different view. Ben, do you want to say some eloquent words about the IMO Polar Code and other issues?
Thank you, Lawson. I'll certainly do my best. I don't know about eloquent, but I will certainly endeavor to give you a high-speed, high-altitude pass on the Polar Code and spare you the PowerPoint presentation in the meantime. So, in summary, the international community, prompted by the opening access in the polar regions, particularly the Arctic, as well as the actual and anticipated increase in traffic, became, appropriately so, concerned about the unique risks that the vessels were going to be exposed to that they weren't necessarily going to be protected by the existing international standards and conventions. Similarly, they were concerned about the environmental sensitivities that were now exposed to this rise in the traffic. So they started to come together with this idea that we needed to create a new regime for the polar regions to protect against these risks and protect the environmental sensitivities. So the result was work by the IMO to develop the Polar Code. This started with the development of international guidelines for the Arctic, but it eventually evolved into a mandatory two-part code that was intended to close the gap between the existing international conventions and the risks and sensitivities that there were in the polar regions. So this is where it's an important time to take note of what the Polar Code was intended to do, because what the Polar Code does is it builds on conventions that the International Maritime Organization had already promulgated, namely the Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, as well as the Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And so using that as a baseline, the understanding that all the vessels calling on those polar regions would already comply with those, what was the delta that needed to be covered? And that's what became of the Polar Code. I mentioned that it's a two-part code. So part one addresses safety. Part two addresses the environmental concerns for the polar regions. For the safety, it takes a risk-based approach to address both operations, equipment, and vessel design. What it requires owners and operators to do is to actually do an operational assessment of the types of operations they're going to do in the polar regions. So this includes what kind of vessels they're going to be using, where they're going to be operating, when they're going to be operating, as well as what kind of operations they're going to do. And then out of that risk assessment comes more specific standards for the operations and equipment and design, but also what they call a polar water operations manual that addresses the capabilities and limitations of these vessels, and it's used by the crew in making decisions. Conversely, on the environmental side, it's a bit more prescriptive. The Polar Code actually comes out with very specific prohibitions and or restrictions on discharges, and then for the newer vessels actually has specific standards for design and construction. With that in place, the Polar Code entered into force in January of this year, so we're well into the implementation phase, and the code is out there for those vessels that are sailing internationally in the polar waters to comply with. But the implementation is ongoing because there's still some other aspects to it, and it's very multifaceted in that regard. Each of the member states of the IMO now have to come back home, look at the Polar Code, look at their domestic legislation, and try to figure out what parts of the Polar Code they're going to have to promulgate through national regulations and standards. Along with that, there's a requirement for, more than likely, for policies. There may be some interim policies required until they can actually promulgate their national legislation. In addition, there's a need for policy that articulates what an administration's point of view might be on specific parts of the code. And so that's ongoing. And in that regard, the Coast Guard is already, the U.S. Coast Guard has already promulgated 2 policy letters, one on training and manning, and another on the safety and environmental provisions of the Polar Code. And that's out there for owners and operators to use as they pursue a polar certificate. Finally, I go back to the operational assessment, and this is part of the implementation. In order to do the operational assessment, owners and operators really need to understand the risks that are out there. And the risks vary depending on what kind of operation you're doing and where you are in the polar regions. And so through the code, local governments, local captains of ports, industry, they all have to kind of, harbor safety committees need to come up with the information that they need to provide to the industry so that they can make informed and insightful operational assessments. And in that regard, it's worth noting that the Arctic Council, through the Working Group for the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment, has underway an effort to support a harmonized implementation of the Polar Code by trying to identify authoritative information that might be used in an operational assessment and kind of find a central location where owners and operators can go, take that information and use that in their operational assessment. So that's just, like I said, a very high-speed, high-altitude summary of the Polar Code and how we got to where we are today for the implementation. Hopefully that provides a little bit of context for today's discussion.
Thank you, Ben. Excellent overview. Vladimir, please.
Yes, slide, please. I would like to show some information about past, present, and future. Third slide.
Third slide.
Yes. Some information about past, present, and future of our atomic icebreaker fleets in Russia. And next, please. 9. And development of the Northern Sea route in Russia as an integrated task within the framework of Russian Arctic policy. It's a rather serious strategic document in our country and extremely important for understanding place of Northern Sea route for our economy, social system, and environmental, by the way. Integrated development United Russian Arctic Transport System formed by the Northern Sea route, and the development of the Northern Sea route based on the meridional rail and road airport network, the transport system of the Russian Federation. It's all this transport system implementing of coastal and marine special development models in Russian Arctic. And I would like to emphasize that development Northern Sea route and coastal zone along northern part of Russia extremely important for our country because share Arctic Zone Russian Federation in national income about 12%, with population less 1%. And in Russia, in the coastal zone, in northern part of Russia, we have 15 freezing ports. Through the sports, we work and extract some of extremely important resources for our industries and for export. And third one, if you heard maybe, that's after 2020, will involve to exploration gas deposits in the Yamal-Nenetsk circle, and common extraction oil gas in this region will be more than 30 million ton. It's a need for a real transport system, and some of institute, next please. Some of Institute of Russian Academy of Sciences involve these projects by interest of Northern Sea Route and the Federal Scientific Center for Integrated Arctic Research. One is a scientific center which involve projects to develop infrastructure Northern Sea Route. And I would like emphasize for us, for in our country, extremely important that we work together with local authorities. Yamal-Nenetsk region, Taimyr Peninsula, and some of companies which involve in this process. And you can see a number of scientific projects we elaborated, and now we are going work under this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Just go back to Vladimir's first slide, because there was an interesting number on it. No, not the first one, second.
Which one?
Third slide. See the number? 3,741 ships piloted back in 1989 at the time of the Soviet era in the Northern Sea Route. So this transport
you mean icebreaker Lenin?
With the icebreaker Lenin. So that, you know, we were talking about 800 ships in the Bering Strait. So puts it in context that this kind of transport marine transport took place during the whole of the Soviet era. Very interesting.
You are very active discuss about built in U.S. icebreaker, and I think that you know about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm not stopping because
great,
I was sure that you know our history of built icebreakers in Russia. Excuse me.
Thank you. Molly, we'll get your slides up here.
Yeah. And while the title slide is coming up, I'm Molly McCammon, Director of the Alaska Ocean Observing System, which is part of the Integrated Ocean Observing System, a national program. We are state, federal, and private. We're a quasi-nonprofit. We operate under the kind of the mode of stakeholder-driven, science-based, and policy-neutral. So I'm going to talk about observing systems more from a local perspective. Next slide. So for navigation safety, we look at observations. We don't look at, these folks are all dealing with ports and icebreakers. Those are megabuck kinds of things. I work with Ed Page and others on a lot smaller kinds of observations. So one of them are high-frequency radars. These are shore-based radars that do surface current mapping. They're used for search and rescue operations and oil spill response. They've been shown that when you have an HF radar system, that you can actually reduce your search area by more than 1/3 to 2/3. So that would be huge along our west coast here of Alaska. So we've been trying to get radars along in key choke point areas on the North Slope, Bering Strait, Aleutian Passes. Right now we have them on the North Slope. We've been putting in wave buoys in the Bering Strait for the last 5 years. The challenge there isn't deploying them, it's getting them picked up before the end of before the ice comes in. We've almost lost a couple of buoys in the past couple of years. Now we're bringing them closer to shore and working with the Port of Nome and others trying to put those wave buoys closer into shore. The other operation we're doing is working with Ed to put weather stations on a lot of the AIS stations so we can have more localized, tailored weather products, and also have the ability to deliver two-way communications and do alerts and warnings, as he mentioned earlier. Another project that we've been trying to do, one of our big challenges is ice, and how do you keep instruments in the water till the very last minute? You want that very late fall information. So we've piloted a freeze-up detection buoy that when it detects, it has a a MET station on top that when it detects frazzle ice, you can send by computer a signal. The MET station falls off, the buoy goes down, and you can retrieve it the next year and put another MET station on. Next slide. So these are all relatively inexpensive types of observations that really add to our maritime domain awareness. If you talk to people in Western Alaska, their big issue, a lot of it is coastal erosion and storms. Without that shore fast ice, communities are really facing a lot of issues there. So we've been funded by the National Weather Service to test a number of pilot projects. We have 3 inland tide gauges on the west coast of Alaska for 3,000 kilometers of distance. Inlands are the kind of the gold standard of water level observations. Delaware coast has 3 for 50 kilometers. So there's a huge disparity of observations. So we're testing all kinds of different things using GPS reflectometry that are shore-based observations, little gauges that go into cages on a shore at a community that they can put right before a fall storm comes in, and testing these various kinds of things, trying to develop a better, maybe less robust, but have broader coverage and a lot more sustainable over time. Next slide. AIS vessel tracking. We've heard a lot about this over the last 2 days. It's the land-based and satellite combined. It's a huge database. Our program has a high-performance compute center based in Portland, Oregon. We're working with ED and a number of partners like ADAC and others to systematize that data collection and put it into a database that can be updated in near real time and queryable for lots of different purposes. These are just some of the things that people want this vessel tracking data for: prioritizing where to do bathymetric surveys, doing oil spill scenario modeling, trying to develop conflict avoidance for subsistence hunters and vessels, trying to develop marine mammal avoidance with vessels as well. So it's a huge need, and I think we finally have the funding support this year to actually tackle this and try to develop some products for this broad user community. Next slide. Environmental intelligence. It's not just the water itself, it's what lives in the water and how people use it. So we are hosting the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. Lots of concern about ocean acidification and how it's going to affect subsistence resources, food security. It's just a major concern to communities throughout Alaska. Similarly, we have some of the highest rates of paralytic shellfish poisoning and domoic acid incidents. So we're also standing up a new Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network. Again, trying to bring together these kind of various community monitoring pieces and information and having a one-stop shop, someplace where people can go for information and network various activities. We've also been working with the university developing ecosystem moorings. So you can't, ship surveys are great, but you can do broad coverage, but only in the ice-free season. The moorings are there year-round. They're in one spot. They do soup to nuts from the ground to the top. Really broad range of ecosystem parameters. And our goal is to have one in the Chukchi, one in the Bering Sea, one in the Beaufort, and one in the Gulf of Alaska. The Chukchi is now fully built out. We're starting on the Bering Sea. Lastly, we're testing the use of gliders for detecting the presence-absence of marine mammals. So acoustic recorders are on them with an Arctic call library developed by Woods Hole. And in near real time, you can track where marine mammals are. This was primarily developed for use in the Chukchi during the oil and gas development there with Shell, but it's also proven useful in other regions of the state and also now in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. So, and lastly, you have all this information, and I appreciated Elizabeth from Quintillion, her comment about the challenge of data access in small communities and how challenging it is. We have a data portal that is now NOAA certified as a regional data assembly center, which means we meet all the bells and whistles and standards for QA/QC. But it is data intense. We have a high-performance compute center based in Portland, Oregon. It's geo-replicated like 3 times. We have lots of information, lots of tools, but it is data intense. We can run models on our system. A lot of communities can't do that. So now we're trying to, how can we develop products that are still useful that they can use in their communities? We host all of the industry data that was collected by Shell, Statoil, and ConocoPhillips in the Chukchi, which was one of the first data sharing agreements with private sector. And let me tell you, it's not just to our benefit, and it's huge for the science community. It's also to the industry's benefit. If they come back in 10 years, they know we have that data. They don't have to go hunting around in boxes in various places in basements in Houston trying to find the data from 10 years ago. So these are the kinds of things that we look at when we talk about an observing system and how to address the marine transportation needs in our region. Thanks.
Thank you, Molly. Great, great. You could see that we had good synergism between what Molly had to say and Ed, and what Drew had to say and Vladimir about integrated transport systems. And then across all of this is this new governance system for the oceans in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and what Captain Hawkins had to say. I'm going to just take my prerogative to ask a question of Captain Hawkins and put him on the spot a little bit here. The Crystal Serenity is coming up. Drop the hook off of Nome. Below the polar code boundary at 60 north, but nonetheless, headed up. What do you think might happen from the Coast Guard standpoint when that ship comes to Nome?
Well, what's going to end up happening is a foreign flag vessel is going to be subject to port state control. As a vessel that sails into the polar regions, it's going to have to comply with the polar code, and therefore, you'd expect that there'd be a port state control boarding. Our officers would go on board. How that boarding would go and what we would be looking at has already been promulgated in policy that we've put out there. And so we go on board, make sure that they're in compliance with the polar code.
What are they looking for?
Well, they're going to start mainly first with the Polar Water Operations Manual, because that's what they need to know. If they've got the Polar Water Operations Manual, they've done the operational assessment, they've assessed the risks, and they've done something to mitigate those risks. That's the primary importance of that boarding. There's other, they can start getting into other details, but that's the very first thing they're going to look at.
Great. No, just to give most of the American citizens there, a few from Canada, what's going to happen in the implementation, but really the enforcement of the Polar Code. And it's a good example that the Crystal Serenity, being this huge ship, the first thing that if I was going aboard as a lieutenant inspector, I'd chat with the captain, have a cup of coffee, and ask for the polar certificate. Let me see the polar certificate. And then, of course, have a long dissertation about the Polar Water Operations Manual. Thank you, Captain. Great. I think I'll take one of the questions here from online. For Ed Page, how does the Marine Exchange AIS note the location of whales? Is it solely based on reports from mariners or through some other method or mechanism?
It's a good question. I mean, right now we have areas that we've known from scientists, whatever, they're high concentration whale areas. So we call a watchdog on it, where we set the speed limit, and we'll have automatically send off emails of vessel exceeding the speed limit in that particular area. So as it turns out, it's kind of like a policeman. Everyone knows at the corner with the radar gun 24 hours a day. Nobody speeds in those areas because they know they're being watched 24 hours a day. Our next step is to get an example is Glacier Bay. They use the hydrophones so they can know where the whales are, similar to what Molly's been doing, locating where the marine mammals are. So we can actually have a dynamic area to be avoided, or marine protected areas. We can send information to vessels real time to the bridge via AIS, say there's a whale concentration, or whalers for that matter, and give it a wide berth and stay out of this area. We can cross-hatch on the chart, or just say a diameter around this point, stay 5 miles away, what have you, or reduce your speed. That'd be working with the science community and with the Coast Guard. Really more the technology can send and transmit information. Someone else is going to make the policy calls, the Coast Guard or environmental protection agencies, identify what actions needed, whether you need to stay away from a walrus fallout area or whatever. That's where the communication, other information, domain awareness from ADAC and AOS and whatever, helps us get the right information in and out to the system to the mariners to minimize environmental.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Molly, has a question online for you. You said that AOS is quasi-nonprofit, but folks want to know, what does that really mean? How much is the government involved? How much is private, or whatever?
Yeah, we're governed by I call it a fairly loose memorandum of agreement. We're housed, our fiscal sponsor is the Alaska Sea Life Center, which is a nonprofit, so they do our administrative and grants management for us. And the reason I say it's quasi is that we would be an official nonprofit, except that you get into these, we have a big federal presence in Alaska, and so our founders were a lot of federal agencies, and we want them to be actively involved and be able to be involved. A lot of them, their lawyers, when they start looking at things, don't want federal agencies to sit on boards, and because you have dual, who do you report to, the board or the federal government? So anyway, it's a MOA housed within the Sea Life Center. We do get a lot of our funding from NOAA, from the federal agencies, competitively.
Thank you. Good. And I think you may have said it, but Ed may have said it, but of course the Marine Exchange is the ultimate public-private partnership. Got industry really driving it, but input from and funds from the Coast Guard, from the state of Alaska. So it is a true public-private partnership, which we hear in the Arctic all the time, kind of glibly thrown out there. And there are not too many of these, and this is a working one, and it's a world-class system. So we have a quasi-nonprofit, but formally set up, and we have a true public-private partnership here. Are there any questions that the panelists would like to ask each other? And then I'll move to the audience. But anything that you all have from anybody else that there's a question? Hey, Vladimir, you have any questions of all of us, since you're the resident Russian expert here? It's okay. No, we'll open it up to the audience.
No questions, just thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Oh, go ahead, please.
Me?
No, Drew has a question.
So for Molly, how do you take the information you have and let the people in the coastal communities around Alaska, the smaller communities, know what's available? And we've always found that's very difficult.
It's very difficult. I think the primary way is by working with kind of our super users. So it would be the agencies who work in the hub communities. It's the Coerics, the Manilics, the North Slope Borough, the Northwest Arctic Borough, kind of those larger groups that we work with most closely. I can tell you that somebody told me that if you could put a MODIS satellite image of ice on a cell phone and have it high enough resolution for subsistence hunters in the spring, you would be God in Western Alaska. So that's the challenge to all of us, is to be able to get that, available on a cell phone. But yeah, it is a challenge. But we have had a series of coastal resiliency workshops in the last year that have really brought a lot of community members together. And I should note that Alaska used to have a coastal management program. The legislature let it lapse, and we do not have one now. And so there is a gap there that I think, in terms of community interaction and engagement, that has been kind of filled by folks like Coeric, Manilic, some of these groups, the landscape conservation co-ops that are funded by the Department of Interior, groups like myself, Alaska Sea Grant agents, stuff. So those perform a valuable service.
Thank you. Great. Questions in the audience? Yes, Helen.
Hi, thank you.
Identify your affiliation. Not everybody knows you. Almost everyone.
Hi, Helen Burrell, Committee on the Marine Transportation System. Thank you so much for the panel. My question is, you're pushing out, Ed and Molly, you're pushing out information to the industry, which I know they appreciate, and especially weather-related information. You don't have a NOAA panelist, but I wondered to what extent you knew of, or there was some corollary to NOAA's vessel observing ship program, where vessel operators provide real-time weather information back to NOAA, since large areas in the middle of the ocean are very hard to monitor. I wonder if you know to what extent there may be that participation in the U.S. Arctic at least, or if there's a corollary in which you're engaged. Thank you.
I could say something that, of course, the Coast Guard cutters, any Coast Guard operation, they report all the weather back to NOAA as a government part. But
so the Weather Service puts out its weather forecast, and then they do get lots of observations that are called in from ships of opportunity, a lot of them from the commercial fishing fleet. That's huge in the Bering Sea. And you will see their weather forecasts are all annotated, and then they're improved. Sea ice forecasts the same way. They're all annotated based on observations and kind of that knowledge that's coming in. We've been doing a couple of pilot projects about putting instruments on fishing vessels and trying to get some more oceanographic information. We just outfitted one of our state ferries with ocean acidification sensors so we can start getting some observations that way. There's a continuous plankton recorder that's been put on a container vessel from Long Beach that goes up to Anchorage once a week, once a month, something like that. So there are different ways of doing it, but it's a challenging still to do that and then have it meaningful.
If I could add, we're also putting weather stations in places where there haven't been weather stations, so it helps for forecasting purposes, and it's consistent data, 24 hours a day, updated every 2 minutes, as opposed to a vessel, it's various different locations and what have you. So that whole Boolean base, all that information together, is very valuable, but no one of those pieces of information can really save the day. You need a combination of different sensors and what have you. We even do current sensors, for that matter. Send the information to AIS to vessels, so in their port, and approaching the port area, a tight quarter situation, they know the current, what have you. So there's several different ways we're going, expanding that capability.
I think it's worth noting, too, that the operational assessment that's required under the Polar Code envisions taking this kind of data and maritime domain awareness into account and doing that risk assessment, both leading up to voyages and in situ during the voyage. And that's part of what the Arctic Council, and I mentioned it briefly, the PAIM working group is trying to find these pockets of authoritative information and provide a portal by which they can quickly access. And we're not sending owners and operators off to find this by themselves. We can put it in a central location for them.
Yeah, good point.
Excellent.
Another question from Henry? Harry, excuse me.
Hi, I'm Harry Stern from the Polar Science Center. I want to get hold of shipping data for research purposes as far back in time as possible. Should I get it from the Alaska Marine Exchange? Should I get it from AOOS? Is it free? Do I have to pay for it?
And it depends, and people ask for it all the time and say, I just want this bit of information. It's 2 million lines of data, so it's a lot of work. So for a month in a particular area. So it's a matter of how much effort it takes. Some of it's free, and some of it's not. Depends on how much data you want. But we go back, not as far as Amundsen, obviously, but we go back about 6-7 years, what have you, of data that we can accumulate in different regions. So I'll give you my card later, and between Molly and myself, we can figure that out for you.
Thank you.
But the Canadians have data for the Northwest Passage. Some of it's on websites. In Russia, the Northern Sea Route Information Center has data for at least full transits, transarctic voyages, and other internal voyages. So there's data, but there's no one site. People ask me all the time, same question, how do I get the database? Well, it's spread around the world. And the only real database, it goes back to 2007 in the AMSA, where we did the first world-class kind of integrated, and we included fishing vessels. But it's a little outdated now, so we do need to have, but now there's much more data with AIS. It's proliferation of data, but nobody's chewing on it and looking at analysis other than Allison here that gave the presentation. She's looking regional. Circumpolar's a harder thing to come by. It'll come.
But there
Might cost you
are
something.
a number of efforts that are doing that.
Yes.
Because the Arctic Observing Network, I'm on a working group on AIS databases, and there's at least 4 international efforts that are going on separate. People hadn't even known about the other, which is kind of common. But now they're all talking together, trying to integrate these kinds of activities. So I think it's going to improve in the next couple of years.
I should also add that the Coast Guard just this last March, that is, not this March, the March before, expanded the carriage requirements on vessels. Here before, they didn't require many of the vessels operated in the Arctic to have AIS because they really didn't have a capability to receive the information. It wasn't really fair. So the carriage requirements have expanded dramatically. So some of the skewing of the data can be attributed to the fact that people now have AIS. Beforehand, they were invisible. Now they're visible again, or for the first time for that matter, not again. So those are things that have influenced the data to some extent. The larger vessels have been required to have it in international trade since around 2004, but the domestic vessels have not been required to have that capability. So those are things that kind of influence the behavior, and people need to understand. And also the richness of the data is a lot of misrepresentation. A lot of vessels are called wing and ground in the Arctic, which aren't wing and ground at all. They're 200-foot vessels. They're offshore supply vessels. They're not flying above like aircraft. So we're always constantly vetting and correcting the data, dimensions, type of vessel, what have you. So it gets kind of complicated when you want to have good data versus raw data, et cetera, et cetera.
Next question. Okay, David? Not projecting.
Jackson from the Canadian Ice Service. It's not really a question, but it's more of a comment and an augmentation on the weather question that you had asked. Any ship that makes synoptic weather reports, you can follow them on SailWX website. And any ship in the world that makes synoptic weather reports, you can follow. That was it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, sure. Since you got your hand up.
Could you just comment on the PAIM effort to compile shipping data that's supposed to come out in 2018?
Oh, well, I can tell you about the old PAIM, but maybe Molly
No, that's
might.
one of the efforts we're working with. I don't have the details on it yet. We're trying to actually just put together a spreadsheet that shows who's doing what, at what resolution, what's their data source, what's their future sustainability, things like that. So, yeah, I don't have the details.
What we did in
on
the
it.
first AMSA, though, was have the Arctic states themselves provide the data. We gave the electronic survey to the senior Arctic officials, who were quite surprised, but then they passed it to their maritime administrations, and everyone was kind of forced before the AAS era to cough up the data. Your national official data, whether it's complete or not, we make no judgments. And so the new effort isn't quite that way. There'll be a central, but it depends. What's Arctic shipping? But really, for the PAIM and for the Arctic Council, and for most of us, it's what vessels are emitting and discharging. So we in the AMSA took 100 tons. It doesn't cover everybody, but it covers a lot of vessels. And so to get that data back 7, 8 years ago was challenging.
So it'll be available in 2018, the PAIM?
Maybe.
It's supposed to be,
Hopefully.
yeah.
Yeah, good effort by PAIM and the Arctic states to pull it together. Another question? We got still a few more minutes. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Kudos to all of you on your work. Part 2 of the Polar Code is silent on air pollution matters. So I have a question for Ms. Pierce in particular. What, if anything, can you and Mr. Treadwell and others do as you promote a League of Arctic Ports and potentially transarctic shipping, quote unquote, to address the concern raised by Niels Bjorn Mortensen from Maersk in the Sea Blind movie that I happened to catch today, regarding the concerns for good enforcement of the 0.5% sulfur standard that will take effect in 2020 for global shipping outside of ECAs, and the concern that poor enforcement in many regions of the world and potentially growing opportunities for transarctic shipping will actually work against the competitive well-being of the good guys that are running ships across the oceans, because they can't compete if they try to comply by using the compliant fuel, and you don't have good enforcement elsewhere. So I'm just curious, what, if anything, can you do long-term, working with insurers and others to try to help the Coast Guard and EPA and others address this issue? I know this is really on the margins. I'm happy to discuss it with you afterward, but Mr. Mortensen had a point that I thought was pretty intriguing.
So what we would like to institute is an international cooperative effort that would basically require ships, obviously, that are using the seaway that we set up to meet the standards that we want them to set. And this whole effort started, frankly, after the Exxon Valdez. We put great prevention and spill response co-ops on the North Slope, Alaska Clean Seas. We've got SERVs in Prince William Sound. We've got CISPRI in Cook Inlet. We legislated the hell out of all of them and forced that. But then we watched and Paul because of his longtime residence and the different positions he held living and working in Dutch Harbor. Other communities in the state were saying, well, where's ours? And then we watched all the transit of the commercial vessels, Innocent Passage, using the northern route, the Arctic route coming from the Pacific Rim to the United States and coming through the pass just outside of Dutch Harbor, and they had no protection. They weren't members. They had no coverage. So how could we possibly get those ships to join some sort of a co-op? How could we require them to? And as a state, unfortunately, and I was in the legislature at the time, as a state, of course, we didn't have the authority. And Admiral Barrett used to tell me often, well, that's a great idea, but the state of Alaska can't make that happen. The Coast Guard might be able to, but in Innocent Passage we can't. So we started looking at what can we do to ensure that all the ships that are passing through our waters close to our communities are members of a co-op so that they have coverage. Do they have a contingency plan? And we want them to have that. That led to the discussions as we started looking at the Arctic, and the communities coming around to the north of Alaska all wanted coverage also because they wanted to know who was out there, who are those people, why are we seeing cruise ship passengers coming onto shore in Barrow, and we didn't even know there was a cruise ship was coming, and where's customs, by the way? Who are these people? So we were looking for something that we could put together that would provide for safe Arctic transit with the bells and whistles that are needed, that would make the insurance companies feel comfortable that the cargo that they were insuring would be safe. And at the same time, how could we require that the ships that use the service meet the standards? They meet the standards of the Polar Code and whatever other standards the entity decides it wants to put into place. So I see all those things as coming together and frankly being the reason. I understand what you're saying about the good guys and are they going to find themselves in an uncompetitive atmosphere, but that's what we're hoping we can stay away from and find a way to make everybody want to be good guys and use this low sulfur fuel. There also has to be a cost-benefit analysis because who's going to bear the costs? The communities on the North Slope from Nome coming all the way around, they're very concerned, gee, all these new regs, what's it going to do to the costs of bringing the materials to us in the village? And the only way we can get those materials is the once-a-year sea lift that we have. They don't want to see their costs go up that make their communities uneconomic to live in. So that's a balance we have to look at.
The air emissions will be covered in IMO in the future with the Arctic Air Emissions Control Zone, for sure. Yeah. And likely, highly likely, oh yes, it's coming, for sure, because there's an air emissions control zone around North America. There is in the Baltic, too. Well, let me finish, if you don't mind. All of the ships in the future of the Arctic clearly will be driven by technology and be powered by gas. In fact, Socomflot, the director, Sergei Frank, briefed the Prime Minister of Russia a week ago, and he said to the Prime Minister that all of our ships by 2022, all of our tankers and LNG ships will be powered by gas. So, you know, I mean, Russia probably lead on this, and they were going to cut the emissions, air emissions anyway. But when you look at integrated systems around the globe, when we did the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, the atmospheric chemists told us that all the contrails, all the aircraft over the Arctic really was a tremendous impact compared to a handful of ships at the surface. And so I would say that, that if we're going to take a look at the Arctic Ocean, it's not just ships, it's aircraft. So you have to, for climate change and for emissions, take the global picture. And you know, a lot of people flew here, right? I don't know if anybody flew over the Arctic, but I do all the time. I'm contributing to the, you know, to the environmental impacts in the Arctic. Likely, highly likely, more than a handful of ships. Now, maybe more than a handful of ships in the future, of course. That's what folks are talking about. But nonetheless, the air emission issue is a challenging one. I wouldn't put it number one on my list. I'm sorry. Heavy fuel oil. There you go. I mean, but it is an issue, and I think from the AMSA, we looked at that and knew that it was coming, but probably not part of the first iteration of the Polar Code.
Time for
One
one
more? We got maybe a couple more minutes, or what do you? Yeah, Martin,
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Sure, first.
Yes,
And I'll get you
and
more.
I'm glad that we got to the emissions part. Ships not only have air emissions, and thanks, Brian, for bringing that up. They have lots of other waste categories. They're all in MARPOL. Polar Code is part of MARPOL. Of course, they are amendments to MARPOL. Some of those provisions in MARPOL that apply to all of the oceans, including the Arctic oceans, basically make the Arctic Ocean a no-discharge zone. Ships have lots of wastes that they generate and that they have to get rid of. What are ports and terminals in the Arctic, as they get developed, are they going to be ready to handle that? Big, important issue, I think.
Excellent point. Thank you. Martin?
Thank you. Lawson, Martin Jeffries, Office of Science and Technology Policy. I have a comment that amounts to a plea, I guess. And it's prompted initially by something you said, Lawson, in your opening remarks. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then I might not have said anything in response to what you were talking about using correct terminology. But then Drew Pearce used a figure that Chris Fladdick used also yesterday morning that got me a little bit agitated, and I feel I need to say something. The figure in question is the map to illustrate this possible railroad connecting Alaska to Fort McMurray, Alberta. Now, when Chris showed the map yesterday, I just sort of looked at it and thought, oh, that's interesting. But I'm sitting a little closer today, and when Drew Pearce showed it, I looked at it, and there are the boundaries between the provinces of Alberta are shown in that map. And I realized that in that map, Fort McMurray has migrated about 1,000 kilometers to the southeast, to south central Saskatchewan. I lived in Alberta for 4 years, so I feel qualified to comment on the geography. So that railroad is going to be an awful lot more expensive than it already will cost should it ever be built to the true location of Fort McMurray. But this gets to the point that was brought up yesterday, that we need facts to inform policy. We better get our maps correct. As an example of that, that is Saskatchewan, not Alberta. Coming back to the comment you made, Lawson, about transit, and in the marine and maritime sense, that has a particular meaning. As a recovering sea ice researcher, I'm constantly reminded of the misuse and abuse of sea ice terminology. We have heard more than once in this meeting the Arctic sea ice cover referred to as an ice cap. Please, it is not an ice cap. An ice cap is a terrestrial ice feature that forms from the accumulation of snow. It is a kind of glacier. If we can't use the correct terminology amongst ourselves, how can we communicate to a broader audience that we're trying to influence, to explain to them and convince them that the Arctic matters? I'll stop ranting. Thank you.
Good points. I mean, language and the words that get me going are, maybe somebody can explain to me where the high north is. And the high north, I can explain to you what it is. It was a domestic internal Norwegian term to cover the north of Norway, which is hardly Arctic. Svalbard's Arctic, but not the north of Norway, because you go to Tromsø in January, it's not ice covered, right? I mean, it's ice-free because of the northward drift and Gulf Stream, et cetera. So even in the political world. But I see in this town sometimes the use of high north, and I've asked a few times, of course nobody knows where the hell the place is, and so, but it's the Arctic. I mean, we're geographers, Martin and myself, supposedly geographers of sorts, and terminology and this marine transport issues, and there are a lot of nuances to it, but thanks for bringing that topic up. Hey, Molly, please.
Well, maybe just to end on a little lighter note on this, too, terminology. So the first time I heard the phrase marine domain awareness was about 15 years ago. So I turned to my experts, a retired Navy captain and a retired Navy admiral, and said, I don't get it. What is this marine domain awareness? They looked at each other and went, let's Google it.
Good, good.
So we've come a long ways in 15 years.
Let's have a round of applause for all the panelists. Thank you.
Google it.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your contribution. In terms of terminology, when someone said that where's ICE, I thought they were talking about immigration control and enforcement. But then I thought maybe they're talking about ICE. Where's the ICE? So thank you very much. We're going to be here tomorrow with a similar program. So